One of the things that I've really grown out of in, say, the last 3 to 5 years is these maximal effort sets and reps in the gym. Just in training, just because. There's a saying, just because you can doesn't mean you should. And it's something that sort of has rang true for me for a really long period of time. Now, my background in strength training means that I've pushed up the weight a lot. And also my entire coaching team is, for the most part, powerlifting and strength training clients. And they're great lifters. They're, top tier lifters with great technique, and they're really pushing the boundaries of their strength. But with that, I think comes a bit of conflicting interests, Me as a physio, working with people from an injury management standpoint, working with people not just for 3 months or 6 months, working with people for 5 to 10 years. You get to see a few things. You get to see injuries unfold. You get to see people rehab through things. People's training progress come in different waves as they go through their life, and their training may change, their outlook on training may change. But it really has led me back to sort of question, these maximal effort sets that we kind of grind through and leave nothing on the table. Now, look, to be honest with you, I actually quite enjoy the thrill of lifting really, really heavy like this. If you sort of threw me into the gym and said, work up to a heavy single on a safety bar squat, I'd actually have a lot of fun doing it. But I'm 36 now, getting a little bit older, and it's one of those things that, for me, I go, there is a trade-off for that. Just because I can do it, it's probably not the smartest way to look at things. From a fun standpoint, from a motivation standpoint, I get it. But if you have to be maximally aroused with the perfect conditions, with 10 people screaming at you, and just complete head noise to get through a set, the reality is that you're probably exposing yourself to a lot more risk than is necessary. And I would argue that you just don't need to do it. We know training, the process. We know the training process very, very well. It's essentially a savings account where we're stacking wins up week on, week out. And we're collecting volume, we're collecting intensity, we're working on training technique and volume over and over and over again. And I think any huge spike in that actually really starts to distract and take away from the longer picture, the bigger picture at play, which is progress over time. If we look at training, it's a constant step up, then come down, then constant step up and come down. And that's something that we just rinse and repeat time and time again. And we do that because we don't really want any training exposures to be crazy big in increase from week to week. It's the level of exposure of volume or intensity would actually then be loading up tissues that aren't necessarily ready to take that load. So we want to start to, look at training and go just because we can doesn't mean we should. And it's something that I've been very conflicted with before. I work with strength athletes predominantly, and I'm getting people ready for competitions, to step on a powerlifting platform. And, sometimes it really does become a bit of a management game. And you're trying to help the lifters as best you can, but it is a little bit conflicting because you're going, I'm going to get this person back to the platform, but the runway is just not very long. So you're having to try and compress things in, not destabilize their system, get them out of pain, and somehow get them back to peak performance, even if that has been modified slightly. The other side of it is, I've seen some really big injuries, not necessarily in my coaching team, but just big injuries in general. And they're lifelong injuries, someone tearing a quad off a bone at the knee, or ripping a bicep, or tearing a pec off the bone. These are big injuries. And I think often when we're in training, when we're really sort of pushing up and we're really wanting to get stronger, we're wanting to sort of get to the top of our sport, we often don't consider the other side. And, there is another side to everything. Training and peak performance does not come without the other side of it as well, which is the detrimental side. And I think often we don't speak too much about it. We speak about specific injuries. We speak about the training process and following the process and, all these different things. But, these events and these situations do unfold in real time. People do get injured. People do get kicked out of our sport, or, powerlifting, weightlifting, gymnastics, whatever it is, because of big injuries. And these are things that live with you for life. And, something like when you get to, say, 50 or 60 years old, are you going to look back and go, like, why did I do that? Like, at what point did that serve me? Now, this isn't to detract away from training hard. Like, it absolutely is not. I'm all about it. It's what, got me into training, managing variables, getting people to get really good at what they do through the training process. But what I'm sort of, alluding to and want to speak to today is, we need to actually think of the other side and, control things that we can control. And I think one of them is just knowing what the other side is, knowing what the worst case scenario is in every single situation, so that you can go, am I okay with that? And if you are okay with it, carry on. But if you're not, you may need to sit and, consider what training is for you. Like, if you wanted to be the best powerlifter in the world, you need to understand that there is a detrimental side to that. Like, you're going to be stiff, you're going to be sore, you are exposing yourself to risk constantly. There's no way around that. But if you're okay with that risk, that's great. But I think a lot of people, especially when, in a day and age where we use social media a lot, we only look at the highlights, we only look at the good side. So we see people doing something, we see the praise that they get, and we're like, wow, that's amazing, I want to be like that. But the people that we look at also, they may be exposing themselves to a point in time where they sustain a pretty big injury. And I think it's something that probably needs to be discussed a little bit. Now, what this discussion is how to manage injuries, because I've spoken about that quite a lot, and I will continue to speak about that. But I just want to sort of, talk about the other side of it, because it is something that I have to deal with a lot in my day-to-day, and it's an area that often just is not spoken about. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. In everything, training, rehab, coaching, everything in between, there is a point of diminishing returns. Now, I want to start off by giving a couple of examples here. If we look at a training session, if we come in and we're working really, really, really hard, at some point during that session, we're actually going to decay. We're going to go backwards. That's the whole point. Managing that is really, really important. Sometimes we're so focused on just doing the work that we do not think about at what point is that work no longer actually helping move us forward. So let's put a bit of an example around this. 5x5 is a very common set and rep scheme that is used often in the industry. It's a really good base strength. Set and rep scheme, it does a lot in terms of building density, in terms of technique, in terms of just, refining a technique over and over again. But it is actually quite a lot of training volume, especially if you are getting stronger. When you increase the load and you were doing 25 reps at these increased loads, it's a lot of work. So about 9 years ago, just to give a bit of a story around this, I was, trying to figure out my coaching systems, and I was, really refining them just so, I'm one of those people that like to control variables. If there's something that I can control in a training program, control it. When we look at set and rep schemes, often, someone will say do 3x3 at 90%. And I'm like, where have you got that 90% from? Or, 4x8 at 70%. Great. These are all, strength ranges and hypertrophy ranges, but where's the system around this? So I was actually on the train. I was in Europe somewhere. I think I was in Poland, and, I spent, 4 hours locked in, and I was just putting together this set and rep scheme. And basically what I did was I collated all this data of set and rep schemes, and I ended up making up this huge table. And it was, all the progressions for sets of 1, sets of 2, sets of 3, sets of 4, sets of 5, working all the way down, I think, to 12s or 15s. Then within that, week by week progressions of how you would phase that through a structured program. Now, I think something with training that we also need to really just take into consideration is how hard an effort should be. Because it comes back to just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. Now, let's put a practical example around this. For me, with a 5x5, I will never go above 80% for someone. 80% is the threshold that they should be working at for 5x5. It works into my ecosystem. If you want more information, send me a message and I'll get back to you. But it works into my system where I know that that's the upper limit. and I work back progressively over, a 4 to 6 week training block, knowing that that is the end point, right? That's really, really cool because I know that I can control that variable. I know that the person that I'm working with isn't going too high into the threshold where it's actually putting them at risk of injury, but I also know that it's high enough that it's stimulating. Now, if this works for someone that has like more identified sort of 1RMs or numbers that they know that they can hit that are heavy, and then you're simply working off those percentages. But for me, it's one of those things that I could probably get someone on the right day with the right effort, with the right hype. I could probably get someone to do, say, 5x5 at 85%, or maybe even pushing the boundary up to 90%. But, at some point during that session, they're going to get really, really fatigued, and there is going to be a massive point of diminishing returns. That might be 2 sets in or 3 sets in. And, the likelihood is that if they're well trained, they can probably grind through another couple of sets. But, the technique's going to drop down. They're going to potentially get kicked out of position or deform their shape in order to get these sets and rep done. And you start to question it. You start to go like, what was that even for? Like if we look at a 5x5 training scheme, it's not meant to be maximal. It's meant to be a base building scheme. So it's like, why are we sitting so high on the threshold for these sets and rep schemes? Which comes back to controlling variables. So you need to know what you're doing with your training program and what you're trying to get out of it. Now, say for instance, someone did want to, push up the intensity on this 5x5, you probably wouldn't do it on all 5 sets. You would have 1 or 2 top sets, and then you could do, 3 to 4 back off sets at a lighter intensity. That's a really logical way of looking at it. Or you might actually just do 2 top sets and then have some accessory work that then feeds into what you want in terms of muscle building. An example with squats could be you could have 2 sets of 5 as top sets, and then you could do some leg press or some hack squat or the pendulum squat to build the muscle building qualities that you want. So there's always a way around it. But if we look at a training session in a whole, so this example is for 1 session, imagine stacking 3 of those across a week. You're going to have fatigue from session 1, fatigue from session 2, and then by session 3, you're going to be absolutely cooked. Now, yes, we need to be dialing up the intensity every single session where possible. Outside of a deload, we need to be pushing that, we need to be pushing forward in a way to actually drive adaptation and progress. That's given. But the rate at which we do it is something that we need to limit and control in people. I often speak about it, but I use percent-based programming for periods of time with lifters because I want to actually slow them down, because at some point during their training year, I don't need them pushing that hard. I just need them doing some really good, honest set and rep work. And then there's other periods where they should be pushing hard. Now, if we look at that across a training block or a training week, if you come in and say you're in week 2 of a program and you really ramp up this 5x5, week 3, week 4, week 5 of that training program is going to be carrying so much fatigue. You're going to be exposing yourself to a huge amount of risk across that training block purely because you're fatigued. If you have a really maximal effort, especially a 5x5 times 3 sessions, that could take weeks to fully recover from. Now, the training process is fatigue, granted. And some people can get through working at those intensities, but you've really got to question the why, because the other side of that is something that's potentially going to take you out of training for a longer period of time. These are types of things that we can really control. So, the bread and butter here is sets and reps for most people, and we really just want to be making small increases from week to week. This is the thing that keeps us within this like stimulation range where it's like savings. We're taking a bit, we're putting it in our back pocket every single session rather than having these big spikes. And I think it's something that just needs to be considered. At what point during every training session, at what point during every training block are you pushing potentially too hard? At what point do you need to go, that's the limit? And that's the constraint that I put on this particular training program. So point of diminishing returns is the first big thing to consider in the opposite side, because you can see injuries unfolding. You can see people where they're really pushing the limits and they're pushing, like they're proper pushing. And it's great. Like it's an attribute. It shows a lot about the character of the person. It's amazing. But there is a certain point where I think the further you get into training and the longer you go on, you start to realize that it's actually, in a lot of cases, quite unnecessary, because it's the base that then builds the expression later on. So you just need to be doing these simple sets and reps over and over and over again, which might not sound that exciting. It might not, be as thrilling as sort of working up to a really, really heavy set. But you get to a certain point where you go, I want to progress, but I want to progress for a longer period of time. And if I'm going to hit a point of diminishing returns in week 2 of my training block, what's the point of doing that? Because then I'm just riding the wave of potentially having an injury, or even worse, potentially going backward for, a longer period of time. Because what we know about training is you can get overtrained. It is a thing. And, there's different viewpoints on it where people say overtrained, under-recovered, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're driving your intensity up with volume and intensity across the training block, and you are working way, way too hard, there is a point at which you actually can regress and you can go backwards. And, there's only so much mindset that can get you through that. The mind is really, really powerful, and it's one of those things that you actually need in order to sort of step up to heavier weights and do more work. But it also can be detrimental if you don't take into consideration that your mind can actually overpower what your body really actually wants to do. So the first point of all of this is defining the point of diminishing returns. So even if you have a set and rep scheme of 5x5 and you do 2 sets and you're cooked, and you cannot do another set with good technique and good form, your best chances of having a really good training session and then continue on with that trajectory is probably just dropping it back for that session. It doesn't mean that's going to be every week, but that particular session has served its purpose. You've had a couple of really stimulating sets. Now you can do some really good honest sets and then get stuck into your accessories without driving yourself into the ground. So it's something that I just ponder on a lot. And it's like, what intensity is too much? What RPEs are too much? How hard do we need to be pushing? Now, I think when we look at the training year as a whole, there are periods in a training year where you should be constraining efforts. You should be pulling it back and just working the base. And there's other periods where we actually need to work higher. But in those higher threshold periods, we're actually really reducing the volume, and you definitely still don't want huge spikes from week to week. So it's the same concept. But, looking at it from a week-to-week standpoint, you shouldn't really have any set or any session that is a huge spike in intensity versus the other. So let's move into the next point. Now, the physiotherapist in me is always balancing out the risk-reward of everything. Often people come in and they are getting close to competition, or they're really ramping up the intensity in their training, and they need solutions and strategies that's going to help them to continue to show up and put the work in and hopefully perform well when it's needed. But there's always a risk reward with this. There's always a trade-off. Now, I have seen some pretty gnarly injuries, and a lot of the time there's a diagnosis which is called acute on chronic. So in the lifting world, we could separate this into 2 things. I would say there are chronic niggles, 3 things. There's chronic niggles, there's acute on chronic injuries, and then there's just straight up acute injuries. Now, acute injuries is like you're squatting and you tear your quad. With no warning signs, it just happens. Acute on chronic is like, say for instance, you've been dealing with knee pain for 2, 3, 4 years. And it's been not unbearable, but it's been, say, a 3 out of 10 constantly. And then you go to squat heavy and you're peaking and you tear both your quads. And I've seen this happen. And that person had been dealing with pain for a pretty sustained period of time. This is what we call acute on chronic. So the stimulus that sort of triggered the actual injury could have been just a normal stimulus for this person that actually wasn't too high or too low in terms of output, but it was just on that particular day, it was just enough that it was going to overload that particular structure. Now, if you think of a leg, right, you think of a quad. If you've constantly got a patella tendon down here that's sore, that means that over time, the inflammation that's actually in the knee and around that tendon, that structure is actually going to become weak over time. So over time, you're continuing to load it, it's getting weaker, but then you're getting stronger and you're putting more weight on the bar and you're doing more sets and you're doing more reps. It means at some point you may actually run into an issue where you have what we call an acute on chronic, and that might rupture, it might be a partial rupture, it could be a quad tear. There are a multitude of different avenues that you can go with these injuries, but the thing is here, we always need to weigh up the risk reward. Now, say for instance, you were training really, really hard, and we'll just use squats because I seem like I always use squats as the example. But say, for instance, you're squatting, and the most that you've ever squatted before is 200. It would probably be reckless to load 220 on the bar. That is a huge increase in overall effort that you have not done the work for. And say before that, you've been working all of your sets and reps off, say, 200 or 180. You haven't probably earned the right to actually squat that 220. So you'd have to weigh up that risk reward of that situation and go, yeah, look, mentally from a motivation standpoint, I would love to squat that and I probably could, but you also need to start to look at it and go like, why would I? Like, is that actually pushing too far that then potentially can put me back or take away from the longer term picture? Now, if we have a look at, strength training, for instance, it's really time in the game here. And if you're doing anything that's going to put you in a position where the risk outweighs the reward, you probably want to draw a line in the sand and say, I'm not going past that point ever. Because it's these decisions that we make that really can make or break what you're doing. If someone comes in and they're, say, 6 weeks out from comp or 4 weeks out from comp, and they've been dealing with a lot of persistent pain in a particular area, and say, for instance, it was just a local comp, or it was a qualifying event where they didn't need to try particularly hard, you would really want to put a strategy in place that's going to help mitigate any potential risk on the opposite side. So say, for instance, you'd been dealing with knee pain, and, mentally you're sharp, mentally you're ready to squat, but you only need to put up a certain total. You would probably try and collect more points in your bench press and your deadlift and do a very, very, very minimal squat in order to capitalize, get your qualifier done, or do the event. Or if you don't actually need to do the event, you might actually have to choose and bite the bullet, forfeit your spot in a comp, and go into a comp at a later point, because we often don't like to think about it, but there is an opposite side to all of this. And the opposite side to that this is, you could have an injury that would stop you from training for 3, 6, 12 months to the capacity that you actually want. So the risk reward is a really, really tricky one to balance out. And it's something that, I've spoken about with my team. It's an area that I find a little bit conflicting, because there is this mentality of this all or nothing mentality when it comes to sports and performance. And look, it is the thing that pushes people forward, but the reality is, for 99.99% of people, we do sports for fun. We do sports to add to our lifestyle. There is a certain point where if you're pushing so hard, it is actually going to start to take away from your lifestyle. You could potentially sustain a type of injury that is going to put you on the sideline. You may even fall out of love with training. You may hate training. Or you may, even worse, get an injury which then limits the way that you want to train. So it's always this balance. And it is a little bit of a conflicting point, because you want to do good by people. You want to help people reach their goals, you want to set them up for success. But I think a big part of this is also making them aware, not making them soft, but making them aware that there is a potential downside to making certain decisions. Sometimes we're set on certain numbers, or we're set on a certain competition, but the smartest strategy is actually just to know when to call it and go, okay, this comp's not for me. I'm going to go back. I'm going to work on my injury, my prehab. I'm going to work on my strength. I'm going to build more muscle mass. I'm going to come back at a later point. And this is something that really is lifting maturity. I see a lot of younger lifters come in and, when they're starting out, they're really, really pushing. Their whole identity and self-worth is wrapped up in their numbers. You get to a certain point where you're pretty stable, you're strong, you're doing things really, really well, that you start to go I don't need to work pushing the bar and the intensity so high that I'm exposing myself to so much risk, because they get to a certain point and they're like, I just love doing the thing. I love lifting. I love training. I love pushing myself. And anything that gets in the way of that, the risk just doesn't outweigh it. The risk outweighs the actual reward. So, I think anyone that's been training for a significant amount of time loves the process of actual training. You have to be really process driven. Enjoy, working on the 1%ers, enjoy taking the wins in technique or adding a set, adding a rep, whatever the metric is for you, you have to enjoy the actual process. So, you don't want to have that, teared out from underneath you is the point that I'm trying to make. And you've always got to really weigh up these risks versus the reward. And, I would say for most people, if there is an impending risk or if there is something that's kind of closing in on you, I can't imagine many situations where the reward would actually be better. Even local level competitions and stuff like that. We don't get paid to do this. We do this for fun. This is something that should be complementing our lifestyle. It shouldn't be something that's taking away from. If you were going to the Olympics or, there's something that you've literally been working towards for the entire life, it is a very different conversation because, people's entire lives, from their childhood all the way through into their 20s, maybe 30s, depending on where they're at, have been dedicated to this one thing. And they would put everything on the line in order to succeed. And, that's a really admirable trait in a lot of people. But, I think it's just something that we actually need to be acutely aware of, that, there is a downside to that. I saw someone that I follow recently as well had a nasty incident with their training. And I was like, wow, that's the ugly side of competitive sport. They're fine, but that's the ugly side of competitive sport that, has to be taken into consideration. If you speak to any of these athletes, you speak to these people that are pushing and, at the limit of what they do, they would all say the same thing likely. They would say, yep, I would do that, hands down, I'll do that again. But for a lot of people, they're training day to day and they're training to add to their lifestyle, for self-confidence, for body composition, whatever it is, probably don't have the luxury of that. They can't afford to not be working. They can't afford to not be supporting their family. So that in itself, actually having a higher risk tolerance, is a luxury that a lot of people don't actually have. So it's just a consideration that I think that a lot of people need to actually understand, that there is a detrimental side to having a mindset that will just do the work. The mindset is something that needs to shift in order to get you better, 100%. But there's a limit where it can actually flip it on its head and actually turn it into a detrimental thing for you. So it's an important consideration to take into account. I want to wrap up this episode by firstly saying that this episode is not about training hard. I absolutely believe that you need to train hard. But I think that when we're training hard, we also need to think of, what is our ideal? What is our goal? Where do we want to get to? And then think about our current training and go, is this aligned with our actual goals? And is there any point in this training program or this training cycle or this style of training that I'm doing that is actually potentially taking away or exposing me to risks that I'm not comfortable with? For me personally, where I'm at now in training is very different to how I was when I was 25. My risk tolerance was so much higher when I was 25. I probably had a lot more to prove. I didn't have as much responsibility. I had a lot more time. I could be a lot more selfish with what I wanted to do. So for me, the risk, didn't even seem like a thing. But now, a little bit older, hopefully a little bit wiser, I now look at training as my vehicle for growth. It's the thing that keeps me grounded. It's the thing that, when it's going well, everything else in my life starts to stack up. And that's true. And for me, I wouldn't want any exposure to risk that would actually potentially put me backwards, because I want to be training for a lifetime. I want to be working on qualities for a lifestyle, for a lifetime. So for me, it's part of my lifestyle. It's what I do. It's what I'm always going to do. So for me, I would actually rather, at this stage, sit on a slightly more conservative approach where I'm continually winning and stacking up these wins week in, week out, block in, block out, over a longer period of time than any one single effort. So it's just a different way of looking at it. And, if you were to sort of get to 60 and look back and go, at any point during that, would I do that same thing again? Would I follow that same path again? If the answer is no, you should probably have a think about where it is that you actually want to go and kind of reverse engineer it. Because, for a lot of people, I've seen some big injuries, and it's terrible to see because, as much as we kind of like to sort of glorify the other side of it, the rehab process, getting back into training really quickly, the mentality behind it, there is someone there that's battling. They're in pain. They're never going to be the same. Once you've had surgery, you're not the same. It's never going to be the same. So there is absolutely a negative side to injury that should be spoken about, not just after the fact. It should be spoken about before, in terms of point of diminishing returns, and in terms of like weighing up the risk tolerance and the risk reward for everything that we're actually doing. Now, this may just be my physio, the analytical side of me looking at it, but the reality is I work with a lot of people, and the people that I work with outside of the actual performance side of it love training, and they wouldn't want anything to take that away. So for them, even just having a fruitful conversation around the potential risks on the other side is actually sometimes enough to get people to start to think about the long-term game rather than the short-term game, because nothing is made short-term. Like, it has to be a long-term game. You can make progress within it, but you have to be thinking of the end goal or the future you, not the current, because if you don't, you're just going to get stuck on this this hamster wheel where you're just chasing your tail constantly, chasing these small wins, where when you look at the bigger picture, you're actually just stacking wins up and adding into that particular system and ecosystem. Now, each week I put out a podcast and I put up a YouTube video. If you want to stay up to date with all of my content, the easiest way is to get in the show note below, follow the link, and you can sign up for my email. I promise you there will be no junk email. It's only going to be really good, helpful content that's going to help you on your fitness, health, and rehab journey. Thanks for today. I'll see you guys on the next episode.